Wren Nolan yanked open the back doors of the delivery van, her arms already sore from the weight of the heavy grocery bags. The ocean breeze whipped her ponytail around as she squinted up at the massive Seaside villa towering above her. She had been delivering groceries for Seaside Market for almost a year, but this was the first time she'd ever been sent to this house. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she muttered to herself, glancing at the crumpled receipt in her hand. The address was correct, but everything about this place screamed private, like the kind of estate that had gates and security cameras and people who definitely didn't do their own grocery shopping. Still, a job was a job. She hoisted the bags onto her arms and made her way up the stone steps to the grand double doors. With a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. A few seconds passed before the door swung open, revealing a man who looked like he had just woken up, or maybe like he didn't care much about appearances. His dark hair was tousled, his gray t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a hint of stubble on his jaw. Still, there was no mistaking it, he was gorgeous. Sharp blue eyes flickered between her and the bags in her arms before he finally spoke. "You're not the usual delivery guy." "Nope." Wren shifted the weight of the bags. "He called in sick, so they sent me." The man's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he stepped aside. "Come in." She hesitated. Normally, customers took their groceries at the door. But before she could protest, he turned and disappeared inside, leaving her standing there. With a sigh, she stepped inside, her sneakers sinking into the plush rug as she took in the grand interior. The house was breathtaking floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the ocean, sleek modern furniture, and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. "You can put them on the counter," the man said, reappearing with a glass of water. She set the bags down and dusted off her hands. "That'll be $72.50. He reached for his wallet on the counter, but something about the way he moved caught her attention, like he wasn't used to small transactions like this. He handed her a $100 bill without a second thought. "Keep the change." Wren blinked. That's too much." He shrugged. "It's fine." She hesitated before tucking the bill into her pocket. "Well, thanks." As she turned to leave, she glanced at him again. There was something about him, something distant, like he wasn't used to company. "Do you live here alone?" she blurted before she could stop herself. His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Yeah." Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. But before she could say anything else, he gave a nod. "Thanks for the groceries." It was a clear dismissal. Wren forced a polite smile and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, the ocean air hit her again, but this time her mind wasn't on the view. It was on the mysterious man inside the house and why he looked so lonely in a place so beautiful. The next time Wren was sent to the villa, she told herself it was just another delivery, nothing unusual. But as she stepped onto the grand stone steps again, she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened. The door opened before she even had the chance to knock. This time, the man looked more put together, wearing a crisp, dark sweater and jeans. His hair, though still slightly tousled, had the purposeful kind of messiness that suggested he had actually looked in a mirror. "You again," he said, his voice carrying something unreadable. "Guess you're stuck with me?" Wren quipped, shifting the weight of the bags. He stepped aside without a word. She entered, setting the groceries on the same marble counter as before. The silence stretched between them, heavier than it should have been. "You live out here full-time?" she asked, glancing at the wide windows framing the endless ocean. "For now." His answer was vague, but she wasn't surprised. Everything about him felt guarded, like a man who had spent too much time alone. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who enjoys solitude," she said, testing the waters. His lips twitched, almost like he was amused by her directness. "And what kind of guy do I seem like?" Wren shrugged. "The kind who's used to people being around. Someone who's used to having, I don't know, an entourage or something." There was a flicker of something in his gaze, something that almost looked like nostalgia. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Not anymore," he said simply. She studied him for a second. There was a weight in his words, something unsaid. But she didn't push. "Well, if you ever decide you need noise in your life again, I work at Seaside Market. It's not exactly a party, but there's never a dull moment." His expression softened, just a fraction. I'll keep that in mind. With that, she turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. What's your name? She paused at the door, glancing over her shoulder. Wren. A beat passed before he nodded. I'm Asher. Something about the way he said it made her feel like it was the first real thing he had shared with her. As she stepped back outside, the salty breeze filled her lungs. But this time, something was different. Asher. The man in the villa wasn't just some reclusive stranger. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she knew this wouldn't be the last time they spoke. Days passed before Wren found herself standing in front of the villa again, a fresh set of grocery bags in her arms. She had convinced herself that the last 2 deliveries were nothing but chance encounters, brief moments in passing. But the way her stomach twisted with nervous energy told her otherwise. She knocked once, and this time the door swung open almost immediately. Asher stood there, looking more polished than before. His sweater was a deep navy, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong forearms. He looked like a man who had once been accustomed to high society, but now found himself in exile, self-imposed or otherwise. You're back, he said, his tone neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable. You do keep ordering groceries, Wren replied, stepping inside. She moved toward the kitchen, placing the bags down. Asher leaned against the counter, watching her with an intensity that made her fingers twitch. You always do deliveries yourself? He asked. Not always. But I like the change of pace. She started unpacking the bags, half expecting him to disappear into another room like before. Instead, he stayed put, his presence filling the kitchen. I looked into Seaside Market, he said, his voice casual, but Wren caught the underlying curiosity. Oh, he nodded. Family-owned. Been around for decades. And yet, you don't seem like someone who grew up in a small-town grocery store. She shot him a look. And what do I seem like? His lips pressed together, like he was debating how much to say. Like someone who's used to moving. Someone who's not tied down. Wren hesitated. He wasn't wrong. She had spent most of her life bouncing between places, never staying long enough to put down real roots. I guess I'm still figuring that part out, she admitted. Asher studied her for a moment before nodding, as if he understood more than she had said. What about you? She asked, meeting his gaze. You don't seem like someone who belongs in a quiet seaside town. A shadow flickered across his face, but it was gone before she could grasp it. Maybe I needed a change of pace too. His answer was vague, but Wren didn't push. Instead, she continued unpacking, trying to ignore the way the air between them felt charged, like something unsaid was hovering just out of reach. As she placed the last item in the fridge, she turned back to him. Well, if you ever need recommendations for things to do around here, let me know. There's more to this town than just groceries. Asher held her gaze. I just might take you up on that. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Wren forced herself to step back, her pulse unsteady. I'll see you around, Asher. And with that, she walked out, the weight of his lingering stare following her all the way back to the van. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythmic sound filling the quiet space between them as Wren stood at the villa's balcony, staring at the endless horizon. The evening air was crisp, the scent of salt and pine mixing together in a way that made everything feel almost surreal. She hadn't planned on staying. When Asher had asked if she wanted to have a cup of coffee before leaving, she had hesitated. But something in his voice, something softer, more open than before, had made her nod. Now, she found herself in unfamiliar territory, standing in a place that felt both intimidating and strangely welcoming. Asher stepped beside her, a steaming cup in his hand. He passed it to her without a word before taking a sip from his own. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something charged. I wasn't always here, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Wren turned her head slightly, watching him as he stared out at the horizon. No, he shook his head. I used to live in the city. Fast-paced. Constant motion. Everything loud. Everything demanding. She took a sip of the coffee, letting the warmth spread through her fingers. And now you're here. His jaw tensed for a brief moment before he exhaled. Now I'm here. She didn't press. Whatever had brought him to this secluded place wasn't something he was ready to fully reveal. But she noticed the way his fingers tightened around the cup, the slight tension in his shoulders. You don't seem like the kind of guy who runs away, she said. His lips parted slightly, as if her words had caught him off guard. He turned to face her fully now, his blue eyes searching hers. "I wasn't running," he said. "I was trying to figure out what was left." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. Wren didn't know his past, didn't know what had broken him enough to make him leave behind a world that had clearly once been his. But she saw the truth in his expression. He wasn't just hiding. He was healing. She set her cup down on the small table beside her. "You ever think about leaving?" His gaze didn't waver. "I used to, but lately, I'm not so sure." Her breath caught slightly at the weight of his words. She knew what he meant. Asher's hand brushed against hers. The touch barely there, but enough to send a shiver up her spine. He didn't pull away, didn't rush. His fingers curled slightly, waiting, giving her the chance to step back if she wanted to. She didn't. Wren turned her hand over, letting her fingers intertwine with his. "I don't know what brought you here," she said, her voice steady. "But I know you don't have to figure it out alone." Something shifted in his expression. A wall lowered, a breath released. Asher lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles as if sealing an unspoken promise. And just like that, the man who had once been a mystery to her was no longer a stranger. He was something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to lose. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving only the gentle glow of the moon reflecting off the waves. The air had cooled, but neither Wren nor Asher made a move to go inside. They stood on the balcony, their hands still loosely intertwined, neither willing to break the quiet moment between them. Asher's grip on her fingers was firm yet careful, as if he was still getting used to the idea of not being alone. Wren shifted slightly, studying the way the wind moved through his dark hair, the way his gaze flickered between her and the endless ocean. "You don't talk much about your past," she said, her voice soft but certain. His head tilted slightly, considering her words. "Neither do you." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Fair point." For a moment she thought he might deflect, but something in his expression shifted. He turned fully toward her, his fingers tightening just a fraction around hers. "There was a time when everything in my life was planned out," he admitted. "Every step, every decision, every expectation. I was supposed to follow a path that had been decided long before I ever had a say in it." Wren watched him closely, sensing the weight behind his words. "But something changed," she said, coaxing him to continue. His jaw tensed slightly before he exhaled, as if releasing something he had held onto for too long. "I lost someone important to me. Someone who saw me as more than just what I could achieve. When they were gone, everything I had been chasing suddenly felt meaningless." Her chest tightened at the quiet pain in his voice. She had suspected there was more to his story, but hearing it now, spoken so plainly, made it all the more real. "You left to start over," she said, not as a question, but as an understanding. "I left to figure out who I was without all of it," he corrected. "And for a long time, I thought maybe I was meant to be alone. Maybe that was the price I had to pay for walking away from everything I once knew." Wren shook her head slightly. "You don't have to be alone, Asher." His gaze met hers then, intense and searching. "And what if I don't know how to be anything else?" She stepped closer, closing the last bit of distance between them. "Then I guess you'll just have to learn." The silence stretched between them, charged and unspoken, until Asher finally lifted his free hand, brushing his fingers along the side of her face. Wren felt her breath hitch, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. "I don't know what this is yet," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that when you're here, everything feels different." Wren swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "Different isn't always a bad thing," she said. Something in his expression softened. And then, without another word, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a slow, deliberate kiss. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was steady, like the waves beneath them, like something neither of them had expected but somehow felt inevitable. When they finally pulled apart, Wren let out a shaky breath. Asher's forehead rested against hers for a brief moment before he pulled back just enough to look at her again. "I think," he said, his voice steady, "that I don't want to figure things out alone anymore." A slow smile spread across Wren's lips. "Good." For the first time since she had met Asher, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. And for the first time in a long time, she felt it too. The days that followed were unlike anything Wren had expected. She had never been the kind of person to get swept up in something so fast. But with Asher, Everything felt inevitable, like the tide pulling her toward something greater than herself. He didn't just let her into his world, he invited her in, piece by piece, allowing her to see the man behind the carefully guarded exterior. They spent evenings walking along the cliffs, the salty air swirling around them as they talked about things that had once been locked away. One night, as they sat on his balcony, a quiet stillness settling between them, Asher leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the waves. "I used to think happiness was something you had to earn," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "That you had to prove you deserved it before it could ever belong to you." Wren turned her head, watching him closely. "And now," his fingers tapped against the armrest, thoughtful. "Now, I think maybe I had it wrong." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You did." He exhaled, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something lighter in the way he held himself. But even as things between them deepened, Wren couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She had learned so much about Asher, the weight he carried, the loneliness he had lived in, but there was still one thing she didn't fully understand. Why had he left his old life behind? She knew it wasn't just grief. There was something more, something he had yet to say. So when she found herself standing in his kitchen one evening, watching him carefully pour them both a glass of wine, she finally asked the question that had been lingering between them. "What did you leave behind, Asher?" He stilled for only a moment, his fingers tightening around the stem of the glass before he passed it to her. "A name," he said. "A reputation. A life that wasn't really mine." Wren took the glass, waiting as he sat down across from her. "I was supposed to inherit a business built by generations of my family," he continued. "The kind of empire that didn't allow for mistakes, for uncertainty. Everything was about control, about maintaining an image." Her chest tightened at the weight of his words. "But when my father died, I realized I didn't want it." He let out a slow breath. "I walked away from all of it." Wren set her glass down. "And they let you?" He gave a dry laugh. "Not exactly. There were fights, threats, attempts to pull me back in. But I had already made my choice." She reached for his hand again, squeezing it. "And do you regret it?" His gaze locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. "Not anymore." Something inside her softened at that. Asher had spent so much of his life being shaped by expectations that weren't his own. But now, here with her, he was finally choosing for himself. And she wanted to be a part of that choice. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind where time felt like it stretched endlessly between them. Asher had taken her out on his boat, the gentle sway of the water lulling them into an easy silence. Wren sat at the bow, her hair whipping around as she laughed at something he had said. Then, without warning, Asher moved in front of her, something unreadable in his expression. "Wren." She blinked up at him, her laughter fading at the intensity in his eyes. "What?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box, and her breath caught. "I spent so much of my life searching for something that felt real," he said, his voice steady. "And then you walked into it, and suddenly everything made sense." Her heart pounded as he opened the box, revealing a ring that sparkled in the sunlight. "I don't want to spend another day without knowing you're mine," he continued. "So, Wren Nolan, will you marry me?" She felt the sting of tears as she let out a shaky breath, nodding before she could even find the words. "Yes." Asher slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into his arms, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that tasted like salt and forever. The wedding was small, just the way they wanted it. The cliffs framed the ceremony, the ocean bearing witness to the vows they exchanged. Asher looked at her like she was the only thing in the world, his hands steady as he whispered the words that bound them together. And Wren knew this was where she was meant to be. With him. Always.